First, before we open up to the audience, I thought we could delve a little bit deeper into the two different discussions that I think you both started. I have a question here that I've kind of edited a little bit to get a little bit more in line with the two talks that were given, but I think it's also helpful for us to begin the conversation a little bit more in depth here. And this is related specifically to a point that was made by both of you, and not only the problem of relativism and also the atomization of the individual with respect to the community, and kind of this inability for the community to, or the individual to integrate, and then for the community to be a place for the individual. But also just in general the way in which we seem somehow incapable, because of that atomization, to really engage in a serious way in politics. So I was thinking particularly about a speech that Pope Benedict gave back in 2001 in the German Parliament, where he pointed out that unlike other great religions, Christianity has never proposed a revealed law to the state and to society, that is to say a juridical order derived from revelation, but instead it is pointed to nature and reason, as you were pointing out, as the true sources of law, and to the harmony of objective and subjective reason. So this idea that the individual can identify some sort of external factor that perhaps might bring him in line with the rest of society, some common ground, so to speak, which naturally presupposes that both spheres are rooted in the creative reason of God. So our question here, perhaps to start the discussion, would be, how can this proposal be made today in the US, considering that in many ways American culture rejects nature and reason in the classical sense as something normative, right? Does that make sense? So the idea that it's very difficult to enter into a discourse if reason is already rejected outright. So is it possible for us to engage anyway? Where do we engage, and how do we engage it as Catholics with this problem? Start there.
Well, I suppose I would begin by saying I don't think that this is a uniquely American problem. I suppose one might say opaqueness to nature, of nature, to most people is a modern phenomenon. I mean, of the last few hundred years, when human life has been more than it ever has been in history, a result of human choices. I mean, that wasn't possible for most of the history of mankind, but in the last few centuries it's become the case, and that distances us from the connections with nature that people typically had. So nature and the natural requires a kind of defense that was not true for most of human history. And it turns out it's not as easy to defend as one might think. I think, we often have gotten into these arguments about, especially in recent times, sexual morality and so forth. And I think that kind of that really shows the problem. I mean, when you sort of concretely have to explain to a person why a certain kind of sexual conduct is wrong on the basis of reason, I mean, it's not as easy to do as you might sort of casually think, and it's no fun either. It's rather unpleasant. But this was not something, and there are many other examples of that had to be done for a long time. So, I think it's a problem that's a problem for the whole of the West. And I'll just say one other thing about it. To do this, to engage in this kind of rational account, is sometimes, and the fact that it often doesn't succeed, or the difficulty of it, is sometimes used as a kind of argument against the notion of a natural moral law, or that it's not an effective way of making discussions and so forth. And as a practical matter, that sometimes turns out to be the case, but I think to some degree people underestimate how unusual it is in human history for discussion of right conduct, happiness, and so forth, the full burden of all that to be placed on the back of reason. For most of history, either religious ideas or social institutions did most of that work. And for us, a disproportionate amount has to be done by reason itself, which has always been kind of not equally distributed commodity and not always one that people are fitted to hear.
Yeah. I think that's actually helpful even to clarify my question, which may have not been as clear as I'd like. I mean, it seems to me, Rusty in particular, that also what you were saying, right, that there, and tying it with what Professor Bradley's saying, that what is the common ground that we have? How can we engage with society when things like reason are in question, when natural law are actually in question? On what basis can we enter into a dialogue when, like you were saying, there's a certain dissolution that we're experiencing, right, in which those stable reference points are being done away with, those things to which we would normally refer and engage upon commonly.
I'm not so pessimistic. I think I go back to the point that it's very unlikely that the way forward is getting the right metaphysics, and it's very likely that the way forward is reviving natural law. Not that it's not very useful and a good thing for people to try to sort these questions out. But I think that we are capable as the amount of political agreement in America, 300 plus million people, is really quite astounding, actually. And I think it reflects the fact that we're more deeply habituated by our traditions and institutions than we often want to admit to ourselves. Now that is breaking down. I'm not sure it's breaking down because of, it's probably breaking down for lots of different reasons. And your point is well taken that we, in the vacuum, we want reason to take up, and reason, reason is very good at prudential judgments about maximizing utility. Smart people can kind of have policy arguments about which policies are most likely to lead to the greatest amount of wealth or something like that. But it's just supremely bad at building consensus about more fundamental moral questions about how we should live together, or whether utility is really the highest good, or these sorts of things. But I'm not pessimistic about the possibility. I think that we live in a time when there's a very broad consensus now that divorce is a bad thing, even though many people get divorced. But that was not true when I was a teenager, when it was widely thought that divorce was by and large a good thing. And I think this reflects a kind of groping toward a truth about human nature in our halting way as a society. So we should be thinking, I think, in terms of our public engagement, yes, critical of the bad things that are happening, but also very careful to try to blow on whatever embers are burning out there, to try to get them to flame up, without demanding that people accept our reasons, if you will. Because I think a lot of people are very hesitant to accept strong moral reasons for public policy because they see it as oppressive. Even if they wind up agreeing with you that that's probably the direction we ought to go. And I think we need to distinguish between the possibility of kind of political coalition from the difference of a kind of a deeper agreement about the moral aims.
I think that's a good segue also to kind of the next question, which would be specific to, this idea of forcing others to accept our way of thinking. So what would it mean also in the sense of entering into politics with a real sense of compromise, while at the same time not abandoning our ideals, right? So obviously we still, as Catholics, are working from a basis of reason. We're reflecting on natural law. We're reflecting on revelation. There's an objectivity to the way that we're thinking, but we'd like to engage. So how do we really think about compromise, and how do we think about political engagement to that effect? So another quote I think that's helpful in thinking about this also comes from Cardinal Ratzinger, or then Cardinal Ratzinger. He says, "The first service that Christian faith performs for politics is that it liberates men and women from the irrationality of the political myths that are the real threat of our time. It is not the adventurous moralism that wants itself to do God's work that is moral, but the honesty that accepts the standards of man and in them does the work of man. It is not the refusal to compromise, but compromise that in political things is the true morality. So again, how does this apply to the two of you, or I mean, from your perspective, to the presence of Catholics in U.S. politics in 2016? What kind of political myths are we facing? What compromises should we accept? What compromise shouldn't we accept?
Yeah, what are the myths that we face? Hmm. Well, certainly on the right, there's a myth that that the market will sort things out eventually. So that's one myth. So if we have problems, globalization leads to disadvantages of certain people, but in the long run, everybody will be better off, and it will be for the benefit of everyone. That's I think a very powerful myth that we have. It's interesting that both on the left and the right, I mean, the left myths are weakened significantly because those myths are collectivist myths, and my argument has been that the collectivist impulse has actually weakened in my lifetime significantly. But the old myth of Marxism was that if you got rid of private property, you wouldn't need politics anymore. So the agony of imperfect prudential judgments about what best promotes the good of the community, we wouldn't have to engage in that anymore, because the state would wither away when there would be no need actually to have political conflict. So we wouldn't need to compromise or conflict. But that has faded, that dream, that utopia of a post-political withering away of the state. And in its place, on the right, we have a view of the withering away of the state. The market replaces the state as the rational allocator of public goods. And so we marketize all problems, and if we marketize them, then we won't have to argue about them politically, because the market the invisible hand will do the work. And that's its own belief in the withering away of the state. I mean, libertarianism is a kind of very uniquely modern dream of a world where we don't have to have politics, just as Marxism was a modern dream of a world without politics. So I think that's kind of one of our I think one of the characteristics of late modern culture is the intense desire to relieve ourselves of burdensome responsibilities, whatever they may be. And politics is a burdensome responsibility because it's very imperfect. There's ample room for self-deception as to when you're serving the public interest, when you're really serving your own interest. And it's an arena of compromise, disappointment, defeat, and so on. Wouldn't it be so much better if we could be relieved of those responsibilities? And as well as I gave the example of family, children, and so forth, that there's a really strong impulse in our time to live without responsibilities, freedoms without duties.
So along these lines, I think maybe the same question to Professor Bradley. Is it possible to compromise with these myths or these different ways of thinking? Is there a way for us to engage in these debates even if we don't entirely agree, even if we can't arrive at the perfect solution? I mean, how is it that we as Catholics, with kind of maybe even the abandonment of reason, the objectivism of and this embrace of relativism, this embrace of individualism, how can we engage even then, right? What do we really have to offer? And I guess the real question again is, how do we compromise without losing that ideal? Is it possible? Should we even try?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Rusty said is right. I mean, I remember recently I read this new biography of Jack Kemp by Mort Kondracki and Fred Barnes, who was a political figure who was quite compelling to a lot of Catholics. In fact, even though he was a Protestant, he had a lot of Catholic supporters. And Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, was a protege of Kemp's. And he was a very admirable man in many respects, a very impressive man. If there were one thing I sort of read in the book that I thought was weird and odd about Jack Kemp was the sort of extraordinary faith that he had in economic growth to solve every problem. And really, it's that can't be right. I mean, it's just the faith that some people have in that respect. I think, there are, about myths, I mean, there are myths and there are myths, and politics always involves, since the time of Plato, we've known this, right? Opinions, some of which are myths, and sometimes the myths are myths that are indispensable to political life in certain circumstances. At other times, they just need to be burst. And in our time, I think that it's still the case that the myth of progress, you might say, which has been around since the 19th century, at least, remains a very powerful one that doesn't have much to be said for it. Rationally, I think. I mean, materially speaking, one can talk about a certain kind of progress, but I think the kind of sort of faith in technological reasoning that Rusty talked about in his remarks earlier is really something that does a lot of mischief, and the limits of that are precisely something that I think need to be constantly pointed out, and that Catholics can do from the perspective of our tradition. And I think that, I mean, the one really sort of, really thing that struck me the most deeply about Laudato Si was the comments that the Pope made there about precisely the idea that there are technological solutions for everything, and his criticism of that thesis, which I think is really quite right. So that's, now as far as compromise goes, look, I mean, politics is inconceivable without compromise unless it's become itself a kind of technological enterprise. I mean, if your thought is that politics is a kind of science, then the only conceivable reason for disagreement there could be is either stupidity or recalcitrance in the face of reason alone. And then the people with whom you disagree are simply to be
stupid or wicked.
Treated. Yeah, either punished or treated,
right.
But not discussed with or bargained with or anything like that. So there's no escaping compromise. That's politics, and to keep clear on the distinctions between what is the political and what's properly speaking sacred is always important.
No, I think that a healthy political culture depends upon what I would call civic friendship. And friendship is based on a confidence that your friend seeks the same ends that you seek. Even if you disagree about how to get from New York to Boston, you're confident that your friend also wants to go to Boston. And I think part of the dysfunctions we see in our society stems from the breakdown of civic friendship because, in fact, we're not confident, actually, that our political adversaries seek the same ends. And I think that is part of the disillusion of these sort of unifying institutions and unifying experiences in our society. I think it's not complete by any stretch of the imagination, but it's more advanced than it was 2 generations ago. I think part of it is, the Great Depression, World War II. These are profoundly unifying experiences, very difficult experiences, but profoundly unifying experiences. And so our political culture was deeply shaped by those shared experiences and the sense of trust that comes from that, even amidst very severe policy disagreements. And then the common enemy in the Soviet Union also was very unifying. Everybody agreed that we didn't want them to bomb us into oblivion or to defeat us in a global conflict. I've often told people we should never underestimate how bad it was for American political culture for the Soviet Union to collapse in 1989. It was a very unifying reality. And so some of the deeper disagreements about what the proper ends of the human person are coming to the surface and becoming more problematic in our public life. I don't think there's an agreement really I think it was a profound agreement in 1950 about the supreme importance of America as a distinctive nation state. And I don't think that that's actually so shared now in our public culture. I think there's actually not complete disagreement, but important disagreements about what role the nation state should play certainly in my generation, in the sort of educational institutions I went to, patriotism was not discouraged, but it was public displays of patriotism were seen to be problematic and to be discouraged. And that this is percolating into our, and I don't think it reflects anti-patriotism. I think it's a mistaken interpretation by many people on the right, but it reflects a different vision of the role of national unity for a kind of globalized future. And I think that part of the political distemper of our time is coming from the fact that many ordinary Americans are beginning to wonder whether or not their leaders have the same interests or have the same sort of public project in mind that they used to assume that, of course, everybody had that. Even if we disagreed about how to get there, we all knew where we were trying to get.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting too, to think about the fact that we've kind of lost something of a unifying aspect that we can all point to and work towards and speak about, that allows us to share some sort of common discourse. It does seem that that's clear that we've lost that. I mean, either with...
Like I would say this, the sort of Trump slogan, "Make America Great Again." I mean, I think in 1964, a politician could have used that, but it would have been an anodyne slogan that everybody was using. Or "It's Morning in America," 1984, Ronald Reagan's campaign slogan. He was able to, capitalize on this sort of, it did get mocked at the time, didn't it? Morning in America? As a kind of cheap apple pie mom and apple pie Americanism.
By the people who lost the election.
Right. Whereas now in 2016, a generation later, I think there are many people on the left that are just very disturbed that Trump is stirring up a kind of nationalism. And whereas I don't think the people in '84, they were kind of frustrated that Reagan could sort of make hay on that. Whereas now I think there's a deep anxiety on the part of many people on the left that there are people in this country who are too patriotic. And that represents this divergence. And again, I think it's a mistake to think that establishment liberalism is anti-American. It has a different vision for how America is going to dominate the world than people on the right have. But it is a vision of American dominance, but it involves downplaying American, you sort of include and domesticate and make the whole world American by downplaying the Americanism. But anyway, I think that this is creating an atmosphere of distrust. And people are like, well, wait a minute. Where am I going to be in all this? I'm Mr. Joe Smo in Omaha, Nebraska. What's my role? And the old patriotic rhetoric provides you with a place, back to my point about solidarities. It provides you with a place, a location. I'm part of a team, the winning team. And we don't, we have a political culture that's renegotiating that kind of vocabulary, I think, in a way that is one reason why we're experiencing such political distemper.
So then I have one more question for you, also related to the previous questions, and then I think we'll take it to the audience. But again, kind of continue with this line of questions and this idea of what is it that we really bring to the political stage, what is it that we offer as Catholics, and what is our political task in the modern West. There was a very well-known Italian philosopher named Augusto Del Noce who claimed that what must matter to Catholics in public life today is certainly not their own power, nor the temporal power of the Church, and not even, as far as politics and the party are concerned, the work of apostolate. What matters is rather the preservation of that religious dimension connatural to the human spirit, which, on the one hand, is the only ground on which the action of grace can bear fruit, and on the other is the only condition to save the world from catastrophe. Do you agree with this assessment? What does it mean in the American context, or rather, is the preservation of that religious dimension really important? Is that something we bring? Is it something that we must bring? Is it
So I think
ultimately the common ground?
What I see is, look, a society where people are not seeking things higher than the political is a society where people, I think, can become slaves of the political and then ultimately become slaves of political myths. One of the advantages of religious faith is it purifies our political myths. And I think that's an important contribution. But I want to go back to preferential option for the poor. I think that the evangelical councils have a profound reparative role to play in public life. That the corporal works of mercy, they re-knit bonds in society. And I think that this is a very important mission that Christians and Catholics, but Christians more broadly, have in our society. If I'm right about the dissolving character and the increasing distrust, then we need to have actions, if you will, below the political, right, that are reestablishing human bonds and connection. And then we need to have actions, sacramental actions, actions of worship that are above the political, if not renew public life, at least provide us with the consolations of the eternal as we endure the temporal.
Mr. Brennan?
I think that's quite right. I just say two additional things. One is actually to go back actually to one of the points that came up before about the unifying effect of things like World War II. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, what some kind of social scientists refer to as the post-war consensus, usually in reference to Europe, but also in the United States. I mean, I think what we're seeing at the moment is that's dissolving. I mean, there really was such a thing. It lasted remarkably long, but it's been in a kind of long decline, really, from probably the late 60s on, and I think it's kind of in its death throes. And one event that I think some people think of as having stopped or slowed its pace, and perhaps at a certain point people saw it as a source of unity. I mean, not in a good way. I mean, in the way that the end of communism was bad for unity. I mean, this was in a bad way good for unity, which is to say September 11th. And I think it's kind of an untold story how, in fact, it's been the opposite. Because I think now kind of looking back 15 years, what's actually happened is that event has in fact exposed and deepened divisions, so that there are some people who think what we need to do is to reunify, to recapture some idea of what our country is and what makes it unique, and to defend it against alien forces. Whereas there are other people that tend to be the peoples of the elite of the culture who think that the people who have the first opinion are in some respects as alien as the enemy. In other words, people who've actually got something in common, the people in the United States who want to make America great again or whatever. To some of these folks, I mean, I don't mean this in a kind of insulting way, but I think when they look at that, they see something that's more in common with, in fact, fundamentalism that leads to political fanaticism than they see people like themselves. And so I think that event has been the opposite of a kind of unifying event. But I think with respect to the specific question, the embrace by the church in its public documents, in social teaching documents, especially of the notion of human dignity, is a thing that's kind of goes without saying, and that Christians have an understanding of human dignity that's deep and revealing is true. But there are other people who have quite different notions of it, and who think of themselves as defending it too. Their view of dignity, of human dignity, is not that human dignity comes from the ordination of human beings to a supernatural end, but rather that the dignity of human beings stems from their creative ability with respect to what's valuable and what's worth having, that human beings are creators of value, and this is where their dignity resides. And I sometimes think of this as a kind of decadent personalism. A kind of personalism has become a kind of watchword even among Catholics, partly because of John Paul II.